There was a time in my life when I didn't understand how powerful the mind truly is. I didn't realize that every result I was experiencing, every success, every failure, every limitation was a reflection of how I was thinking. I let the outer world dictate what went on inside me. If things weren't working out, I assumed that meant they never would. If my bank account was empty, I convinced myself that was proof I wasn't capable of more. I didn't know that I could operate with the higher side of my nature, the intellectual factors that make me unique as a human being. I had the ability to choose the image I wanted to hold in my mind, to get emotionally involved with that image, and to allow it to take root until it became my reality. But ignorance blinded me. I believed that life happened to me, not through me. Most people live that way, reacting, doubting, and hoping that things will somehow get better. They set goals, but deep down they don't believe those goals are possible. And because they don't believe, they start looking for evidence that their dream will fail. They look to the empty wallet, the unpaid bills, the lack of opportunity, the absence of progress, and they say, "See, it's not working." They don't realize that by doing this, they're letting their current results control their thinking. And when your current results control your thinking, you stay stuck exactly where you are. I remember when I first learned this truth, it was like a light turned on inside me. I began to understand that results are the effect, not the cause. The cause lies in the invisible realm, in thought, belief, and emotion. But before I knew that, I did what almost everyone does. I set a goal, and then I started to look for the signal that it was happening. I'd check the numbers, the circumstances, the outer signs. When I saw nothing changing, I got discouraged. I'd start thinking, maybe I'm fooling myself, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And that's where the spiral begins. You start with a dream, but because you don't see proof, you let doubt creep in. You stop feeding your vision and start feeding your fear. At first, it feels harmless, just a little worry, a small question mark, but that worry grows. It becomes the dominant vibration of your being. You start to expect disappointment. You anticipate failure. You replay what's gone wrong in the past, and before you know it, you're emotionally invested in the wrong picture. That emotional involvement with the negative image produces a feeling, fear, and fear, when it settles and expresses itself physically as anxiety, it's not magic or mystery. It's law. Energy must move. The moment you think a fearful thought, that thought triggers a feeling, that feeling triggers a vibration, and your body begins to express it. Sometimes people ask me, why do I feel anxious even when nothing is happening? Because something is happening inside. Anxiety is the physical manifestation of an idea you've been holding in your subconscious mind. It's the body's way of saying, you've been focused on the wrong thing for too long. I used to think anxiety just appeared out of nowhere. I thought it was caused by stress, work, or circumstance. But then I realized the root of all of it. Ignorance, not knowing. Ignorance of how the mind works. Ignorance of who we really are. Ignorance of the fact that we can choose what to think, how to feel, and what to expect. That ignorance creates worry. Worry turns into fear. Fear expresses as anxiety. And anxiety, if left unchecked, turns into physical dis-ease, both mentally and emotionally. I've met so many people living in that silent struggle, thinking they're broken, when in truth, they're simply uninformed. They don't need to be fixed. They need to understand. Understanding is the great healer. When you understand something, you gain control over it. You stop being a victim of random emotions. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start realizing, this is happening because of me. Because of what I've been thinking, believing, and expecting. There's great freedom in that realization. Because if your past thinking created the life you have now, then your new thinking can create the life you want. I'll never forget the moment I admitted my ignorance. For years, I had pretended to know everything. I was proud, defensive, unwilling to learn. I thought asking questions made me look weak. But when I finally said, I don't know, teach me, that was the beginning of change. It's funny. People are afraid to admit ignorance, yet it's the doorway to wisdom. Everyone is ignorant in some area. I still am. There are countless things I don't know, and that's fine. The key is to stop being ignorant about yourself. I may not know how to build a car or fix a pipe, but I do know how to direct my mind. I know how to take a thought and hold it until it becomes real. I know that every picture I build in my imagination is like a seed, and whatever seed I nurture, that's what will grow. Think about it. Everything you see around you, every building, every invention, every piece of progress, began as a picture in someone's mind. The Wright brothers saw themselves flying before they ever left the ground. Edison saw the light before it ever lit a room. Every great achievement began as an idea, nourished by belief. And so does every great life. When I learned to operate with my intellectual faculties, imagination, reason, will, perception, memory, intuition, my world began to shift. I realized these are not just words, they are tools. Tools that allow us to shape the invisible and turn it into the visible. But they only work if we use them consciously. Most people use them unconsciously, imagining the worst, reasoning from limitation, perceiving problems instead of possibilities. When you reverse that process, when you begin to imagine what you want and refuse to let the outside world dictate your internal world, that's when you start to live with power. That's when results begin to change. Perfect. Chirat, here's part 2 of your $6 word first-person motivational script, continuing seamlessly from where part 1 ended. This section goes deeper into how worry, fear, and anxiety form a destructive chain, and how understanding breaks it. I've learned that fear isn't something that just happens to us. It's created, built piece by piece from the thoughts we hold and the energy we feed. Most people think fear comes from outside conditions, from lack, uncertainty, or danger. But fear doesn't come from what is, it comes from what we imagine could be. It's born in the mind, nurtured by ignorance, and expressed through the body. Let me explain how this happens. Every time we think a thought, we send a signal through our nervous system. Our brain, that extraordinary control center, interprets that thought as either safe or unsafe, positive or negative. If the thought carries doubt, insecurity, or worry, the body reacts instantly. The nervous system doesn't analyze, it responds. And that response is called emotion. Emotion means energy in motion. It's the movement of energy through the body, the physical echo of our mental activity. So when I used to sit and think about what wasn't working, my empty bank account, my lack of progress, my uncertainty about the future, I was unknowingly programming myself for fear. Each worried thought sent a signal that said, danger, you're losing, you're not enough. My nervous system would tighten, my breathing would shorten, my heart rate would rise. I wasn't being attacked by anything physical. I was being attacked by my own imagination. That's how fear takes hold. You don't see it coming because it starts invisibly. You think you're just anxious about money or worried about tomorrow, but in truth, you're building an emotional storm, one thought at a time. And here's the tricky part. Once fear settles in, it begins to justify itself. The mind starts collecting evidence to support the emotion. It says, see, you didn't get that opportunity. You failed before. You're behind everyone else. The fear starts to feel logical, and that's when it becomes dangerous. Because once fear feels logical, you stop questioning it. You begin to live in defense mode, constantly reacting, constantly doubting, constantly expecting the worst. You might still talk about goals, but deep down, you've stopped believing in them. You've handed over the steering wheel to your emotions. I remember the moment I realized I was doing this. I was sitting alone, overwhelmed, feeling like my life had come to a dead end. Every time I try to think of a solution, another fearful thought would appear. What if it doesn't work? What if I fail again? What if I lose everything? I was fighting an invisible enemy, my own conditioned thoughts. And then I heard a voice within me say something that changed everything. You can't conquer what you don't understand. It hit me hard. I realized that my fear wasn't mysterious. It was mechanical. There was a pattern to it. First came ignorance, not knowing who I was or how my mind worked. Then came worry, me focusing on what could go wrong. That worry generated fear, an emotional reaction. Fear expressed itself physically as anxiety, tightness in the chest, uneasiness, sleepless nights, and that anxiety created more worry, keeping the cycle alive. It was a perfect loop until I chose to break it. How do you break it? You begin with understanding. You realize that you are not your emotions. You are the one generating them. You are not the fear. You are the awareness behind it. And once you see that clearly, the power starts to return to you. I remember studying how the central nervous system works. It's the most sophisticated electrical network in existence. Signals move through it faster than lightning, thousands of impulses every second. And every one of those impulses is carrying an instruction, coming directly from your thoughts. That means that every single thought is a form of programming. Each one sends a vibration through your body, creating your emotional climate. So, if you're constantly thinking thoughts of lack, your body vibrates with fear. If you think thoughts of gratitude and abundance, your body vibrates with peace and expansion. And here's the truth. I discovered the body always expresses the dominant vibration of the mind. It can't hide it. Fear shows up as anxiety. Doubt shows up as hesitation. Confidence shows up as calm. Faith shows up as flow. Once I understood this, I began to observe my own state throughout the day. I'd ask myself, what am I feeling right now? And then, what thought created that feeling? It was incredible to see the connection. If I was anxious, I could trace it back to a single fearful image, something I imagined going wrong. If I was confident, I could trace it back to a clear mental picture of success. Everything, absolutely everything, began in thought. That's when I stopped fighting emotions and started directing them. I learned to interrupt fear by replacing the thought behind it. Instead of focusing on what I didn't want, I began to visualize what I did want. Instead of asking, what if I fail? I began to ask, what if I succeed? It sounds simple, and it is, but it's also powerful, because your mind can only hold one dominant thought at a time. If you fill it with faith, fear loses ground. If you fill it with doubt, fear multiplies. You are the one who decides which one to feed. There were moments when I had to remind myself of this truth again and again. When circumstances didn't change quickly, fear tried to sneak back in. But I learned that persistence in the new thought was everything. If you hold your faith longer than your fear, your reality begins to shift. It's a law, not luck. The thoughts you emotionalize will eventually materialize. If you emotionalize worry, you attract more reasons to worry. If you emotionalize faith, you attract opportunities to prove that faith right. The difference between success and failure is not intelligence, it's awareness. One person lives by reaction, letting fear run their life. Another lives by understanding, using fear as a signal to refocus their mind. The same energy, directed differently, produces entirely different results. I began to look at fear differently, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. It was there to show me where my faith was weak. When fear appeared, I didn't resist it anymore. I'd pause and ask, what am I believing right now that's causing this? That question alone was enough to dissolve half the fear. Because once you expose a lie, it loses power. And that's what most fear is, a lie. A distorted image of the future that exists only in imagination. It has no real substance until you give it your attention. When I stopped feeding it, something remarkable happened. My mind began to quiet down, my body relaxed. And for the first time, I felt a sense of control. Not over the world, but over myself. That's when I truly began to live. Perfect, Churat. Here's part 3 of your 6,000 word script, continuing naturally from part 2. This section marks the emotional and mental turning point, where awareness deepens, ignorance dissolves, and faith begins to grow. The real transformation began the moment I decided to stop running from myself. Up until then, I had been trying to fix results, working harder, pushing more, chasing success like it was something outside of me. But all that effort led me in circles because I was trying to change the effect without addressing the cause. It was like standing in front of a mirror, frustrated by my reflection, and trying to fix it by wiping the glass, never realizing that what needed changing was me. When I finally turned inward, everything started to make sense. I realized that my outer world was nothing more than a projection of my inner world, a mirror reflecting my dominant thoughts, emotions, and beliefs. And if I didn't like the reflection, I had to change the image I was holding inside. That awareness hit me like a wave. It was both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because I could no longer blame the world for my struggles. Liberating, because I finally understood I had the power to change them. For so long, I had been conditioned to think that the outside world controlled me. The economy, my background, my past mistakes, the people around me. I thought circumstances were fixed and that I just had to adapt. But that belief was part of the ignorance that held me back. The truth is, the power to create always begins from within. Everything visible starts from something invisible, an idea, a picture, a belief, a vibration. And the moment you begin to understand that, life stops being random. You stop feeling like a victim of chance and start feeling like a co-creator of your destiny. That was my turning point. The day I decided to stop letting my results control my thinking and start letting my thinking control my results. I began to study, not casually, but deliberately. I studied my own mind. I studied the laws of cause and effect, the power of thought, the nature of belief. I started to see that ignorance was not an insult, it was simply not knowing. And the way to eliminate ignorance is through study and understanding. When you study something long enough, it starts to reveal its structure. Fear stops being a mystery. Failure stops being personal. You begin to see patterns, and patterns can be changed. I started applying that understanding to everything I did. Whenever I felt doubt, I didn't try to suppress it, I studied it. I'd ask myself, where is this coming from? What am I assuming to be true that might not be true? And more often than not, I found that my fears were built on false beliefs. I believed I wasn't capable, but that wasn't true. I believed I didn't have what it took, but that wasn't true either. I believed my past defined my future, and that was the biggest lie of all. One day, someone said something that shifted my entire perspective. What you were yesterday, you paid for. What you are today, you decide upon. That line sank deep into my soul. It meant that every moment, this moment, is a fresh starting point. It meant that no matter how many times I'd failed, no matter how many mistakes I'd made, I could choose differently right now. And that choice would start changing everything that followed. I realized I didn't have to condemn myself for the past. The past was over. It had already been paid for in full. through experience, pain, and lessons learned. The only thing that mattered was what I chose to believe and act upon now. That realization dissolved a lifetime of guilt and self-criticism. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack filled with regret, and someone finally told me, "You can put it down now." From that day on, I began to see myself differently. I started to speak to myself with kindness instead of judgment. I began to visualize the person I wanted to become, not as a distant fantasy, but as a real possibility. I held that image in my mind and got emotionally involved with it every single day. At first it felt awkward, even fake. But then I realized, everything new feels strange at the beginning. A child feels awkward when they first learn to walk. An artist feels uncertain with their first brush stroke. Confidence doesn't come before the act. It grows through repetition. So I kept going. Every morning I'd take a few minutes to close my eyes and imagine the life I wanted. Not the life I had, but the one I knew I could create. I'd see myself calm, confident, joyful, and free. I'd see myself surrounded by abundance, love, and purpose. And most importantly, I'd feel it. That emotional involvement was the bridge between thought and reality. Because thought alone doesn't move the world, emotion does. Emotion is what gives thought energy, and energy is what shapes matter. It's like electricity. The power is always there, but it only lights the bulb when it flows through a conductor. Emotion is that conductor. When you get emotionally involved with an idea, you set creative energy in motion. And that's what understanding taught me, to stop thinking of my dreams as distant hopes and start feeling them as present realities. That shift in vibration began attracting new ideas, new people, and new opportunities into my life, not by magic but by law. When your mind changes, your world rearranges. I used to think faith was something mystical, that only special people had it. But I discovered faith is nothing more than understanding applied. Once you understand how something works, you can trust it. You don't fear electricity because you understand how to use it. You don't doubt gravity because you understand its laws. Faith in yourself works the same way. When you understand who you are, a creative being with the power to think, choose, and act, you stop doubting yourself. You stop waiting for signs that your dream will happen. You become the sign, and when that happens, you begin to experience a peace that has nothing to do with circumstances. Because now your faith isn't tied to the outer world. It's rooted in understanding, and understanding is unshakable. That's when I began to see miracles unfold. Not the kind that defy nature, but the kind that fulfill it. The kind of miracles that happen when you align with truth. My energy changed. My health improved. My confidence grew. I was no longer trying to force results. They began to flow. The same outer world that once seemed hostile started to respond to me differently. Because I was different. And that's the secret. Most people miss life doesn't get better by chance. It gets better by change. And change begins within. Perfect. Cheer at. Here's part 4 of your 6 all-in-word motivational script, continuing directly from part 3. This section moves into the faith and visualization phase, where the internal transformation begins to translate into visible change. The tone remains deeply reflective, grounded, and emotionally charged, your Rohn heritage signature style. Once I began to understand how my thoughts and emotions work together, I realized that faith wasn't just a word, it was a force. It wasn't something to hope for, it was something to use. Faith is not a matter of religion or philosophy. It's the quiet, unwavering conviction that the unseen is more powerful than the seen. Most people think they'll believe something when they see it, but life doesn't work that way. You'll only see it when you first believe it. When I began to apply this principle consciously, everything in my life started to shift. I stopped waiting for signs and started creating them. I stopped asking, when will things change? And started saying, things are changing because I am It's a different kind of awareness. At first, it feels subtle, like standing on the shore and sensing the tide pulling in before the waves arrive. But the more you hold that faith, the stronger it gets. You start to realize that life mirrors your internal vibration with perfect accuracy. You can't attract peace while thinking in turmoil. You can't experience abundance while emotionally rehearsing lack. Faith is not blind, it's intelligent. It understands that thought and energy precede form. It knows that before a tree exists, there must be a seed. And before any success can appear, there must be an image, a clear, emotionally charged vision of what you want. That's why I started to visualize every single day, not just occasionally, but consistently. Every morning and every night, I would close my eyes and see the life I wanted to live. I didn't visualize as a spectator. I visualized as the participant. I imagined myself already living the life I desired, feeling the emotions that would come with it, breathing as that person, thinking as that person, and something beautiful began to happen. My subconscious started to accept it as real. You see, the subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined.